Hyeon-Ju learned, over decades of treating bodies and listening to quiet grief, that the most dangerous disasters are the ones people refuse to name. She was 49 and ran a small community clinic in a coastal city where everyone still greeted each other by routine, even when the sea turned the color of iron. On the evening the weather reports began using the word Haesong, the room smelled of clean towels and rice steam, and the television tried to sound calm while showing the Won River creeping up its banks. Her husband, Sun-min, paced the hallway on the phone with a warmth he rarely used at home, speaking in clipped promises: tomorrow morning, no mistakes, keep it controlled, donors expect stability, then returned to the living room wearing that polished smile that made strangers trust him instantly. He kissed her forehead like a gesture practiced for cameras and said, casually, that the northern dam might open its gates if the typhoon shifted. Don't worry, he added, voice smooth as varnish, our system is the most modern in the country. Hyeon-Ju nodded, but the words landed oddly, because Sun-min always knew things too early, as if the truth waited for his permission to exist. The next day, the typhoon's edge began to bite the city, not with one dramatic strike but with pressure, wind that dragged branches across streets, rain that thickened into sheets, power that blinked and recovered like a tired heart. Hyeon-Ju kept the clinic open anyway because she couldn't imagine closing a door while people were still outside. Half an hour before she locked up, a man stepped in drenched and shaking, as if he'd run through mud and fear at the same speed. Kam Dae-ho, an engineer from the dam, was usually quiet and apologetic, the type who bowed even to a receptionist, but today his eyes were wide and dry, and he held a sealed plastic envelope as if it could explode. Hyeon-Ju cleaned the cut on his eyebrow and asked what happened. Dae-ho swallowed hard and said, barely audible, the sensors are lying. When she asked what he meant, he tightened his grip on the envelope and whispered, someone made them lie. If the level keeps rising, it won't be flooding. It'll be a release. Hyeon-Ju tried to keep her voice steady, told him to sit, breathe, explain. Dae-ho shook his head once, like a man who already knew how this ended. They'll blame the storm, he said. They're delaying the gates on purpose. She asked who they were. Dae-ho didn't name anyone, he only pushed the envelope toward her and added, if something happens to me tonight, open it. Take it to someone who still cares about right and wrong. Before Hyeon-Ju could ask anything else, her phone rang with her mother's thin, frightened voice from a village closer to the river. The bridge is shaking, her mother said. Water's in the yard. Hyeon-Ju promised she was coming, but the call broke apart in static and died. When she looked up, Dae-ho had already stood, backing toward the door as if every second inside the clinic increased his chances of disappearing forever. She told him to stay, to let her call the authorities, to file an official report. Dae-ho gave her a look that made her chest tighten. The authority is the problem, he murmured, and then he left, swallowed by rain. Hyeon-Ju stood alone with the envelope in her hands, feeling its weight like a stone, and made a decision that felt small but would later prove fatal to her old life. She did not call Sun-min. Not yet. She didn't even fully understand why. It was instinct, the same instinct that tells you a patient is bleeding internally even when their skin looks fine. By evening, the city's evacuation announcements began. Loudspeakers urged calm, shelters were listed, routes were suggested, yet something about it felt delayed, softened, almost careful. Sun-min appeared at the clinic in the middle of the chaos, immaculate despite the weather, saying he'd been called to coordinate response and everything was under control. Hyeon-Ju watched him speak to staff and volunteers, watched the way people's shoulders relaxed at his confidence, and noticed the urgency behind his eyes, like he was racing an invisible clock. When she mentioned the river level, he smiled and said, don't listen to technical rumors. People panic easily. The word rumors hit her like a slap, and she thought of Dae-ho's trembling hands. Then, as the clinic filled with evacuees, a man entered carrying a small girl in his arms, his uniform soaked, his expression sharpened by years of pulling strangers out of water. Junho, now 50, Coast Guard captain, stopped in the doorway when he saw Hyeon-Ju, and for a second the storm outside became quieter than their recognition. They hadn't seen each other in 26 years, not since before Hyeon-Ju chose the calm certainty of Sun-min over the fierce, honest burn of a younger love. There was no time for nostalgia. Junho handed the child to a nurse and told Hyeon-Ju in a low voice that evac buses were being held back from the river zone. She asked why. He didn't speculate much, only said, orders are coming from the municipality that don't make sense, and the way he said it told her he was afraid of a human decision, not the weather. Near midnight, when the clinic quieted for a few minutes, Hyeon-Ju finally opened Daeho's envelope. Inside was a USB drive, a metal key tagged Room 4B, old control, and a folded memo written in hurried, shaky handwriting. The note said the dam's sensor calibration had been altered to underreport pressure, that maintenance had been deferred, that reports were being sanitized for public stability, and that the gate opening was being delayed to protect an illegal private development in the valley, an expensive hideaway for names that could not be attached to a scandal. One line was underlined twice, as if the writer needed the future to read it clearly. If the main gate jams at this level, it won't be an accident. It will be slaughter. Hyeon-Ju tried to call Sunmin and heard only ringing. She tried again. Nothing. The lights flickered. A deep metallic groan rolled through the night, not thunder, not wind, something stressed, something structural. Hyeon-Ju tucked the USB against her body, grabbed her raincoat, and drove north through roads that looked like dark rivers, passing stalled vehicles and diverted patrol cars that seemed to be guiding traffic away from one specific direction, as if someone had decided which neighborhoods deserved time. At the dam complex, she expected frantic emergency crews. Instead, she found silence and private guards in dark rain gear standing where public workers should have been. She claimed she was medical staff searching for engineer Kang Dae-ho, possibly injured, but the guard checked a list and said, too quickly, that Dae-ho wasn't on duty. That was when fear sharpened into certainty. He hadn't gone home, he'd been erased. Hyeon-Ju followed a damp corridor until she found an old door marked 4B, the lock stiff as if it hadn't been used in years. The key turned. Inside, dusty monitors slept, panels sat dead, and a lone computer glowed with a small red standby light. Hyeon-Ju stepped carefully, breath shallow, and then she heard voices through the wall, professional, low, confident. In the middle of them came a short laugh she knew from her own kitchen, from dinners where Sunmin had smiled at her while planning something she wasn't allowed to understand. His voice followed, calm and decisive, the dam can hold 2 more hours. Nobody opens anything until I give the signal. Hyeon-Ju's blood turned cold. She shifted back, but the wet floor betrayed her with a thin creak. The voices stopped. A pause, heavy, listening, then the 4B handle began to turn slowly from the outside, not with panic but with certainty. The door opened, and Sunmin stood there, immaculate even in the storm, looking at Hyeon-Ju like she was no longer his wife, but a problem he needed to solve before sunrise. Sunmin didn't shout, didn't lunge, didn't even look surprised. He stood in the doorway like a man stepping into a room he already owns, rain beating on his coat without ever seeming to soak him, and that control, more than the storm, more than the dam, was what made Hyeon-Ju's chest tighten. He glanced past her into the dusty 4B room, then back to her face, and asked in a soft tone that sounded almost affectionate, "What are you doing here?" Hyeon-Ju forced her voice to stay even and said she came because she heard an engineer might be injured and because the city was panicking and she wanted to help. Sunmin's smile appeared, polite and thin, the same smile he used in photos when he wanted to look compassionate without feeling it. He told her she was a good person and that good people sometimes misunderstand complicated situations, then added, quietly, "You're tired. You've been under stress. Don't let your imagination hurt you." The words were gentle, but the meaning was sharp. He was already preparing the official version where she becomes the unreliable one. Hyeon-Ju kept her posture calm the way she did with patients who hid addictions behind charm. She asked why private guards were on a public dam, why evac buses were delayed, why the city's signboards were dead. Sunmin didn't deny anything outright, he simply framed it, the way powerful men frame crimes, as necessities. He said the municipality was preventing panic, that controlling information was part of saving lives, and that people like her only saw individual suffering, not systems. Then he said something that confirmed the memo in her pocket was real. He mentioned the valley development as if it were a delicate matter that could not be exposed during a storm. He claimed opening the gates too early would destroy the lower access roads and trap people, and he spoke as if he were protecting the city. Hyeon-Ju realized he was building a story where every choice he made would sound logical later, once the water covered the details. She asked him, carefully, if he knew where Kang Dae-ho was. Sunmin's eyes stayed relaxed, but a faint tension flickered in his jaw. He said Dae-ho had been removed for safety, then leaned closer and lowered his voice, "You should stop saying that name." Hyeon-Ju felt heat rise behind her eyes, not tears but rage, because she suddenly understood what Dae-ho had meant by "the authority is the problem." She wanted to demand the truth right there, to ask him how long he had been doing this, how many people he had decided were acceptable losses. But she didn't. She knew this wasn't a marriage argument, it was a power struggle. And she had no power in a room where he controlled the doors. Sunmin shifted to block the exit with the ease of someone who has practiced subtle intimidation. He asked if she had taken anything from inside 4B. Hyeon-Ju said no. He watched her for a long second, eyes scanning like a security camera, then reached toward her raincoat as if he might search her. Hyeon-Ju's stomach dropped, but she moved first, stepping back into the room and placing her hand on the old control desk as if steadying herself. She said she felt dizzy and asked for water, and Sunmin's expression softened just enough to show how he viewed her, a manageable woman, a useful symbol, a wife who should remain quiet. He turned his head slightly, signaling a guard in the corridor, and in that tiny opening of attention Hyeon-Ju acted on the only advantage she had left, surprise. She grabbed a metal clipboard from the desk and let it drop hard against the floor. The sharp clang echoed down the corridor and made the guard glance in. Sunmin's eyes flicked toward the sound, irritated, and Hyeon-Ju used the half-second to slip her fingers into her coat and ensure the USB was still pressed safely against her body. A deeper sound rolled through the building then, low and heavy, like steel complaining under weight. The floor vibrated, not enough to topple anything, but enough to make Sunmin pause. Hyeon-Ju saw it, a calculation behind his eyes, a private fear he didn't want anyone else to witness. The dam was becoming less obedient than his plans. She said softly, "If the main gate jams, people will die." Sunmin's face returned to calm, but his calm had hardened. "People die in storms," he replied. "The city will need leadership, not hysteria." Hyeon-Ju understood with sudden clarity that he wasn't improvising, he had rehearsed this future. In his mind, tragedy was not a failure. It was an opportunity, a stage where he would stand in the cleanest suit and promise investigations after the water washed away the inconvenient truths. Hyeon-Ju lowered her gaze, apologized, and said she was scared. She let her shoulders sag, performed weakness with the precision of a woman who has had to survive in rooms run by men who confuse control with love. Sunmin relaxed a fraction, believing he had restored the natural order, and stepped aside enough for her to pass. Hyeon-Ju walked out slowly, like an obedient wife returning to safety, then turned the corner and ran. She ran down the corridor, boots splashing on wet concrete, past private guards who assumed she was harmless, and didn't stop until she reached the outer stairwell where the wind hit her like an open hand. She burst into the storm and sprinted to her car, hands shaking as she started the engine. In the rearview mirror she saw silhouettes move at the building entrance, and she knew that even if Sunmin didn't chase her physically, he would chase her with something worse, reputation, paperwork, a public narrative that would bury her alive. She called Junho with fingers that kept slipping on the screen. When he answered, his voice sounded grounded, like an anchor dropped in chaos, and she told him she had proof the dam sensors were manipulated and the gates were being delayed on purpose. Junho didn't ask why she was at the dam or why her husband was involved, he asked where she was and whether she could drive. Hyeon-Ju gave him her location and said she could, and he told her to head to Old Pier Road, to a repair workshop owned by a retired engineer named Beck who still kept radio equipment and emergency transmitters. "Don't go home," he added, and there was a weight in that sentence that made Hyeon-Ju's throat tighten because Sunmin had not spoken to her like someone worth protecting in years. Old Pier Road looked like the edge of the world in a storm, dark warehouses, flooded gutters, boats groaning against ropes. Beck's workshop sign glowed weakly through rain. Inside, the air smelled of oil, metal, and stale coffee, and the old engineer's eyes were sharp in a face worn by decades of watching water behave badly. Hyeon-Ju handed him the USB-in memo, and as the files loaded on his old laptop, Beck's expression changed from skepticism to dread. He listened to timestamps, to technical notes, to clipped voices discussing calibration and pressure thresholds with the coldness of people who weren't the ones living downstream. Beck said the words Hyeon-Ju feared most. At this level, a stuck gate is a countdown. He explained that even a partial slip could create a surge faster than most neighborhoods could evacuate, and that if the mechanism seized, the eventual release would not be controlled. Junho arrived soaked, uniform half covered by a rain jacket, and when he saw Hyeon-Ju his eyes went straight to her face, not her body, as if he needed to confirm she was real. He asked if Sunmin saw her. Hyeon-Ju said yes. Junho's jaw tightened, and he didn't curse, didn't rage, he simply shifted into action, calling his teams, redirecting boats, ordering loudspeakers to the lowest streets. They began broadcasting warnings on an old emergency frequency because the official channels were suddenly too quiet, too polished, too calm. Within minutes, calls flooded in, people near the river saying they received no alert, people begging for routes, people reporting that buses were being diverted away from certain roads. Hyeon-Ju stood over a paper map with Beck and started marking where elderly residents lived, where the clinic's most fragile patients were located, where shelters needed generators and insulin. Junho moved like a man who had stopped wishing the world were fair and learned to save what could be saved anyway. In the middle of that relentless urgency, Hyeon-Ju felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, not romance like a sweet distraction, but trust like oxygen. Junho listened when she spoke as if her words mattered. He didn't treat her fear as hysteria. He treated it as information. Then Sunmin struck back, exactly the way Hyeon-Ju predicted, through the story. A municipality alert pushed to phones, warning citizens not to trust unverified rumors and describing a clinic manager who was spreading panic. Her name wasn't printed, but the description was precise enough to cut. People in the workshop glanced at her. Doubt rose like poison in the air, because shame is the fastest way to silence a good person. Hyeon-Ju felt her throat tighten, but Junho looked at her and said, "Lo, we don't need everyone to believe. We need enough people to move." Beck added, bitterly, that official calm often arrives just in time to kill the last chance of survival. Hyeon-Ju realized Sunmin wasn't only delaying the gates, he was trying to delay belief. Outside, the storm deepened, and the sound from the valley returned, metal groaning, water roaring, a structural complaint that grew louder with each minute. Beck stared at the pressure readings and muttered, almost to himself, "It slipped." Hyeon-Ju asked what that meant, and Beck's eyes lifted, grim. A slip meant the mechanism had moved under force without proper control, and a second slip could trigger a surge that would outrun cars and warnings. Junho grabbed his radio, voice sharp, ordering immediate evacuation in the lowest blocks, no waiting for official confirmation. Hyeon-Ju tried calling her mother again and got only static. Her hands began to shake harder, not from cold but from the terrible sense that everything was collapsing at once, the dam, the city, her marriage, her old belief that the people in charge were at least trying. In the middle of that, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, short, blunt, impossible to ignore. "He's not at the command center. He's at the Valley property." Hyeon-Ju stared at the screen, heart pounding, and felt a new fear rise, sharper than water. If Sunmin was at the illegal development, then the dam wasn't being delayed for the city at all. It was being delayed for whoever was hiding behind those gates. She looked at Junho, at the radio in his hand, at Beck's trembling readings, and understood the next truth that would define the night: surviving the storm was no longer the only mission. Now they had to drag the truth into daylight before the flood could wash it away. The Valley property sat behind a private road that wasn't marked on any public evacuation map, and the closer Hyeon-Ju and Junho drove, the more the city's chaos felt guided, as if invisible hands were steering traffic away from one protected place. Floodlights appeared through the rain like pale moons, illuminating a manicured gatehouse and two SUVs idling with their engines on, while downstream neighborhoods were going dark. Even in a typhoon, the valley glowed with electricity, and that contrast, luxury lit up while ordinary streets drowned, made Hyeon-Ju's anger settle into something colder and more useful. Junho parked behind a maintenance shed and killed the engine. The roar in the distance was not thunder, it was water gathering confidence. He looked at Hyeon-Ju and said, "Lo, we go in, we get proof, we get out." Hyeon-Ju nodded, fingers pressed against the USB under her coat, knowing proof was the only weapon that could cut through Sunmin's polished official calm. They moved along the fence line until they found a service entrance half hidden by shrubs, the kind used by workers who fix things quietly and leave without being noticed. The keypad was disabled, forced into manual, and Junho used a thin tool from his emergency kit to slip the latch. Inside, the air changed. It smelled like cedar and expensive detergent, clean enough to feel insulting. A corridor led toward the main lodge, and through wide windows Hyeon-Ju saw figures in warm light holding glasses as if the storm were entertainment rather than a threat. Staff moved with silent precision. In the garage area, 2 men in dark raincoats carried sealed boxes into a truck, not like people saving supplies, but like people moving evidence before the water could reach it. Junho's gaze sharpened. Hyeon-Ju whispered, "They're evacuating secrets." Junho answered without turning his head, "Then we don't waste time." They followed the low hum of voices toward a conference room and stopped behind a pillar where the glass wall gave them a narrow view. Sunmin was there. He wasn't soaked or frantic or surrounded by emergency charts like a public command center. He was standing over a table with calm men in tailored clothing, speaking in the same steady tone he used at town halls, the tone that made ordinary citizens relax. A heavy-jawed older man pointed at a map and spoke about liability and exposure. Sunmin replied smoothly, "The gates stay delayed until our guests are secure. If there's a surge, it's the typhoon. We'll announce sensor failure, unexpected pressure. We will appear shocked." The casual way he rehearsed tragedy made Hyeon-Ju's stomach twist. Another man asked about the engineer who raised concerns. Sunmin's answer came without hesitation, "Kang Dae-ho is unstable. He's off duty. He won't be believed." Hyeon-Ju's fingernails dug into her palm, but she stayed still while Junho angled his phone, recording through the narrow gap, capturing Sunmin's face and voice in a frame he couldn't later call rumor. Then the building trembled. Not a polite shake, an unmistakable vibration that made a glass of water ripple on the conference table. The room fell silent for a beat, and for the first time Sunmin's composure flickered into something human, calculation under fear. A staff member rushed in and whispered in Sunmin's ear, and Hyeon-Ju saw his jaw tighten. He didn't panic, he redirected. "Move everyone to the upper lodge," he said, voice clipped. "No one leaves the property." The older man asked if they should open the gates now. Sunmin paused 1 second too long, then answered, "Not yet. 2 more hours." Hyeon-Ju felt sick, because 2 more hours wasn't an engineering decision, it was a bargaining decision, a man trading bodies downstream for comfort upstairs. Junho pulled Hyeon-Ju back into the corridor. "We got enough," he murmured. "Now we leave." But the property had shifted into lockdown. Guards in dark rain gear appeared at corridor intersections, radios crackling, doors clicking into place. They weren't searching for criminals, they were searching for disruption. Hyeon-Ju realized Sunmin's world worked the way his smile worked, quietly controlling the room before anyone noticed. They slipped down a service stairwell where the luxury ended and concrete began, and the air smelled of machinery and wet steel. Hyeon-Ju's phone buzzed again, no name, just a location pin inside the property, followed by 3 words, "Dae-ho is here." Her heart kicked. If Dae-ho was alive, he was the living key that made the USB more than a file. Junho's expression hardened. "We find him," he said, "then we go." They found Dae-ho in a storage alcove behind stacked equipment, bruised, soaked, eyes bright with the animal fear of a man who has been hunted by people with authority. When he saw Hyeon-Ju, his shoulders sagged like a rope finally released. "They said you were lying," he whispered. Hyeon-Ju answered, "Steady, they want everyone to think I'm lying." Dae-ho swallowed and told them the main spillway actuator had been deliberately neglected, the manual override was stiff, and Sunmin's people had orders to hold it until the valley guests were safely moved. He said he tried to force it earlier and was attacked, then showed his ribs with dark bruising like proof. Junho asked if opening the spillway now would save the city. Dae-ho's voice shook, but his words were clean. "It will reduce pressure. But it will send a controlled surge. If people are still in the lowest streets," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Hyeon-Ju felt the thought land like a stone, even the right choice can kill if made too late. They moved deeper into the service corridor until Dae-ho stopped at a steel door with a faded plate that read Old Control. Hyeon-Ju's fingers closed around the metal key tag in her pocket as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The lock resisted, then gave. Inside was a cramped room filled with outdated gauges, levers, and a monitor that showed the valley channels swelling in angry lines. It was ugly, forgotten infrastructure, the kind politicians don't photograph. Dae-ho put both hands on the manual lever and breathed like a man preparing to lift something heavier than his body. Junho radioed his teams again, voice sharp, ordering full evacuation of the lowest zones immediately, no waiting for official confirmation. Hyeon-Ju tried calling her mother. Static. Again. Static. She felt her throat close and forced herself to focus, because panic was a luxury the flood would not allow. Outside the control room, footsteps. Radios. The sound of guards moving with purpose. Hyeon-Ju's skin prickled. Sunmin's people had traced them. Dae-ho looked at the pressure gauge and said, almost pleading, if we wait, the gate can jam. Then the release will be uncontrolled. Junho stared at the monitor, then at Hyeon-Ju, as if asking whether she could live with the consequences of acting now. Hyeon-Ju answered with one sentence, quiet and final, we don't get another chance. Junho nodded. Do it, he told Dae-ho. The lever screamed. Metal resisted like an animal refusing to move, then shifted with a violent jerk that jolted through the room. On the monitor, pressure lines dipped and surged. Outside, the roar deepened, closer now, like water finally receiving permission to run. Hyeon-Ju's stomach dropped, because she knew this surge would be blamed on failure, and Sunmin would use that blame to protect himself unless she could force the truth into public first. The door behind them rattled, then slammed open. Guards flooded the corridor. Sunmin stepped in last, immaculate, face composed, eyes cold with contained fury. He looked at the lever, at Dae-ho's trembling hands, at Junho standing between him and the controls, and then his gaze landed on Hyeon-Ju with something that resembled contempt more than betrayal. You always wanted to feel important, he said quietly. Congratulations. Now you've made yourself dangerous. Junho lifted his phone again, thumb already hovering over the live button, and Sunmin's eyes narrowed. Put that away, Sunmin ordered, voice low. Junho answered just as low, no, the simplicity of it made the room feel smaller. One guard stepped forward. Another reached toward Dae-ho. Hyeon-Ju's mind raced, calculating not romance, not pride, but survival. If they lost the phone, they lost the proof. If they lost Dae-ho, they lost the witness. If they lost the lever, they risked a jam that could turn a controlled surge into slaughter. The storm outside roared louder as if reminding them that time was not on anyone's side. Sunmin took one slow step closer and said, almost gently, if you walk out with lies, you will be arrested for inciting panic. Your clinic will be shut down. Your mother will lose her home. And everyone will thank me for restoring order. Hyeon-Ju felt the threat wrap around her like cold water, because it wasn't empty. It was a plan. She looked at Junho, saw the steady refusal in his eyes, and realized the next move had to be decisive. The pressure gauge jumped again. Somewhere beyond these walls, the surge was already moving downriver. Hyeon-Ju tightened her grip on the USB in her coat and understood the truth with sudden clarity. The final battle would not be fought here in the dark control room. It would be fought in public, with Sunmin's own voice and face pinned to the disaster he tried to disguise. And to reach public, they had to get out, now, before the guards turned this room into a grave. Hyeon-Ju didn't negotiate. She had spent too many years watching Sunmin win by turning every conversation into a courtroom where he wrote the rules. In the cramped old control room, with the lever screaming under pressure and the monitors flickering like a tired warning, she understood the only way out was speed and visibility. Junho kept his phone low but ready, thumb hovering over live, while Dae-ho braced the lever with both hands, jaw clenched, sweat and rain mixing on his face. Sunmin's guards moved in slow, deliberate steps, confident in their numbers, and Sunmin stood behind them with that polished calm that always made his cruelty sound reasonable. Put the phone down, he said, as if offering a favor. Junho answered without raising his voice, "Not today." The guard nearest the door reached for Junho's wrist, and Hyeon-Ju reacted before fear could paralyze her. She grabbed the metal tool tray from the wall and slammed it to the floor, the clatter sharp enough to make two heads turn. In that half-second, Junho hit live. The screen caught the cramped control room, the pressure gauge, Daeho's bruises, and Sunmin's face framed in harsh fluorescent light, no longer a politician on a stage but a man standing inside the secret he told the city didn't exist. Junho spoke into the stream in a steady rescue voice that didn't beg anyone to believe, it simply stated reality. He said this was the Private Valley Properties Control Area. He said dam operations were being interfered with by private security. He said the spillway had been delayed while downstream neighborhoods were left without timely evacuation. Hyeon-Ju stepped into frame only long enough to hold up the USB drive and the memo, then tucked them back under her coat because proof is useless if it's stolen. Sunmin's composure cracked into irritation. "This is misinformation," he said, louder now, and the lie sounded thin in a room where the pressure gauge was screaming the truth. A guard lunged for the phone, and Junho pulled back, twisting his shoulder away, keeping the camera trained forward. Hyeon-Ju shoved a rolling cabinet into the guard's path. It hit his shin, he stumbled, and the stream caught the chaos in shaky but unmistakable fragments, hands grabbing, Daeho yelling, "Don't force the lever. It can seize." Sunmin barked an order to shut it down, then froze when the building trembled again and a deep roar rolled up through the concrete as if the valley itself was rising to testify. In that instant, the storm outside stopped being background noise and became a deadline. The controlled release they'd initiated was already moving, and any attempt to slam the system back could jam the mechanism and turn a bad surge into slaughter. Daeho made the bravest choice in the story, not because it looked heroic, but because it looked like work. He planted his feet, gripped the lever harder, and refused to let anyone touch it. "If it jams," he said through clenched teeth, "you'll kill them." A guard grabbed his shoulder. Daeho didn't fight the guard, he fought the physics, holding steady so pressure could bleed off instead of exploding. Sunmin's eyes darted to the monitor, then to the corridor, and for the first time Hyeon-Ju saw fear on him that no smile could cover, not fear of consequences for others, but fear of consequences that might reach him. He realized the stream was still running, realized his face was already out there, realized the valley property was no longer a rumor. He snapped, "End it," and stepped forward, but at that exact moment Junho's radio crackled with voices from the outside world, rescue teams confirming they were pushing loudspeakers into the lowest blocks, boat crews reporting families moving uphill, Beck's old emergency frequency repeating evacuation instructions that the municipal channel had delayed. The city was finally moving, not because Sunmin allowed it, but because people had heard a truth raw enough to cut through official calm. Hyeon-Ju grabbed Junho's sleeve and pulled him toward the service corridor, because visibility without survival becomes a martyr story, and martyrs don't save evacuees. Junho backed out keeping the camera on, and Hyeon-Ju moved behind him, shielding the USB under her coat as if it were a heart. Sunmin tried once more to weaponize her life, lowering his voice into something almost intimate. "You walk out with this," he said, "and you lose everything. Your clinic. Your name. Your mother's home." Hyeon-Ju looked at him with a calm that surprised even her, and she answered with the simplest truth she had learned after years of being underestimated, "I already lost you. I'm not losing them." They slipped into the corridor, slammed a heavy maintenance door behind them, and ran through concrete hallways while the valley roared outside like an approaching train. Somewhere behind, guards pounded and shouted, but now their shouting wasn't private. It was being heard by the public, by the stream, by the city that had finally begun to realize where the real threat came from. They reached the garage exit and burst into the rain. The floodlights made everything look unreal, luxury cars lined like trophies, staff scrambling upward, VIP guests being moved like fragile packages. Junho's phone feed shook as they ran, catching the absurd contrast, a palace evacuating itself while the city below fought water with bare hands. They dove into their vehicle and drove out through a side lane as the first surge hit the lower valley channels with a sound like the earth breaking open. It wasn't one clean wall, it was a violent acceleration, water spilling where it shouldn't, swallowing roads, dragging debris into motion. Junho's radio filled with urgent updates, boats launching, families rescued from rooftops, sirens rerouting, while Hyeon-Ju's hands trembled around her phone as she tried to reach her mother again. This time, the call connected. Her mother's voice came through thin but alive, breathless, and she said she'd made it to the ridge with a neighbor's help, that the water had taken the garden and the front steps but not her life. Hyeon-Ju closed her eyes for 1 second, and in that second she felt the kind of relief that leaves you weak, because it arrives only after you've accepted the worst as a real possibility. By dawn, the storm began to loosen its grip, and the city revealed its wounds in daylight: mud-stained streets, shattered storefronts, neighborhoods silent in a way that made survivors speak in whispers. But the story that spread was not the one Sunmin planned. Clips from the live stream circulated faster than any official statement: Sunmin inside the valley property, private guards near dam controls, Daeho's bruises, the pressure gauge, the words about delaying for guests. Journalists arrived at the valley gates before Sunmin could rebuild his narrative. Prosecutors and investigators followed the noise the way sharks follow blood. Sunmin stood in front of cameras with a practiced expression, but his face had already been seen in the wrong room at the wrong time. When he tried to call it misunderstanding, the city heard it as what it was: damage control. Allies began to disappear. Donors stopped answering. The same people who once praised his leadership suddenly remembered they had concerns about his methods. The valley property, built to hide, became the brightest spotlight in the region. Hyeon-Ju found her mother at a shelter on the ridge, wrapped in a donated coat, hands trembling around a cup of warm broth. Her mother didn't collapse into dramatic tears. She gripped Hyeon-Ju's wrist hard, as if she needed physical proof that her daughter was real. Hyeon-Ju held her and finally allowed herself to shake, because there are emotions you postpone until survival is secured. Junho stood nearby, speaking quietly with rescue volunteers, then stepped closer and asked, simple and sincere, "Are you okay?" Hyeon-Ju almost laughed at how rare that question had become in her marriage. She answered honestly, "Not yet," and Junho nodded as if that was fine, as if healing didn't need to be rushed to be real. Sunmin's fall came the way real consequences arrive, not as a single cinematic arrest, but as a slow collapse of protection. Daeho gave formal testimony. The USB files matched internal logs. Maintenance deferrals had signatures. The sensor failure narrative didn't survive scrutiny because storms don't forge paperwork. Hyeon-Ju reopened her clinic weeks later, and people came not only for medicine but for reassurance, for the quiet comfort of someone who refused to let power rewrite the truth. She did not become famous in the glamorous way Sunmin once chased. She became something steadier and rarer in a wounded city, trusted. And when she walked home in the evenings, she no longer felt like a background ornament in someone else's ambition. She felt like herself, flawed, tired, alive, and finally unwilling to be silenced. If this story kept you listening to the end, then you already understand why Hyeon-Ju's fight wasn't just against a storm or a corrupt husband, it was against the idea that ordinary people must accept lies as order. And if you want more intense, emotional Korean-style sagas like this, full of suspense, romance, and hard-earned justice, please subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter we tell will be even more gripping, and you won't want to miss it.